Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. I'm your host, Cassie Stossel. On today's episode, we're talking about healing sexual trauma. Our guest is Erika Shershun, author of Healing Sexual Trauma Workbook. Erika is a somatic psychotherapist who specializes in helping sexual trauma survivors reclaim the life they were meant to live. She's the author of the upcoming Healing Sexual Trauma Guided Journal in March 2025, the facilitator of the PESI Sexual Trauma Clinic training, and the upcoming Sexual Trauma Healing Journey in fall 2024. Her approach is trauma-informed, rooted in somatic principles, drawing on neuroscience and integrative models like EMDR, energy psychology, parts work, and mindfulness. Erika offers individual online therapy sessions in California and provides coaching to clients outside of the state. You can contact her at erikashershun.therapy.com or subscribe to her mailing list to receive your free copy of Chapter 1 from the Healing Sexual Trauma Workbook at healingsexualtrauma.com. Hi, Erika. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, Cassie. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
I really enjoyed reading through your book, and I wanted to start off this conversation by asking, what is somatic therapy, and why is the body the first place you start when working with someone who's survived sexual trauma?
So, somatic therapy can include working with the body's sensations, patterns of constriction or movement, balance, and how we interact with our environment in the healing process. It's a holistic modality that honors the interconnectedness of the mind and body. Some somatic therapists use touch in their sessions, always with permission. A larger portion do not use touch. So, our culture tends to prioritize the brain over the body. Most of us don't grow up talking about our sensations and what they're conveying, or even learning how to regulate our emotions and what they're telling us about our needs. So, it's interesting that neurobiology now recognizes the brain is not limited to the one in your skull. Brain includes a heart brain and a gut brain. More information flows from the heart and gut to the brain than from the brain to the heart and gut. Paying attention to what the body's conveying can bring a wealth of information to the healing process. Also, people can get triggered by emotions and sensations and not realize they're connected to past traumatic experiences. Their body remembers, but they don't have the explicit episodic memory. This is the memory that plays like a movie in your mind. This is because trauma memory is not the same as non traumatic memory. It's primarily implicit, emotional, and procedural memory. Procedural includes sensations and patterns of movement. So, in other words, traumatic memory is stored in the cells of the body. Many survivors dissociate from their body. They might have felt numb, checked out, like they were outside of their body because it wasn't safe to be in their body during the traumatic event. A pattern of dissociation can continue on, making it hard for them to feel their sensations, to establish a sense of grounding, to be fully present, and to draw from the wisdom of their body. For all of these reasons and more, we want to pay attention to and work with the body in order to integrate the traumatic experience or experiences. We start by learning to cultivate a felt sense of safety or relative safety, which is needed in order to do the work of healing.
I'm fascinated by the body connection to mental health in general. My own personal experience, just like not realizing mentally that I was anxious, but my body was telling me that I was, and so I'm really interested in all this somatic work. So what does it mean to heal from sexual assault, and what does that look like?
So, when I speak of healing, I'm referring to a significant reduction or elimination of trauma symptoms. This includes processing and integrating the traumas and memory reconsolidation. Memory reconsolidation gets to the deeply rooted negative beliefs about oneself. These are often beliefs that intellectually you know aren't true, like I'm worthless or unlovable or helpless. Beliefs that we take on when bad things happen to us to try to make sense of it and to give ourselves the illusion of control. If we're the problem, at least we could do something about that. So even though as adults we tend to know these beliefs aren't true, the problem is they show up when our autonomic nervous system becomes dysregulated. Memory reconsolidation replaces these beliefs with new supportive beliefs that are self generated. For myself, healing looked like this. I finally experienced a felt sense of safety, allowing me to be fully present when I choose, so absent any actual threat, rather than unwittingly reliving the fearful trauma stories of my past. It's been years since I've had a flashback or experienced intense dissociation. PTSD and intestinal autoimmune diagnosis both cleared up, and I no longer suffer from depression and unprocessed shame. I get triggered from time to time. Triggers are like anxiety. We never fully eliminate either. But I'm not triggered by the sexual traumas. They're in the past where they belong. This feeling of no longer being tethered to the sexual traumas of your past is what I consider healed. The belief that we never heal from trauma, especially sexual trauma, seems to be a popular one. I don't agree. There's always more exploration or work we can do with ourselves. There's always room for growth, which keeps life interesting. Yet the traumas of our past don't have to be a life sentence. So I am of the belief that healing is the best revenge.
I love that. I think that's really powerful, and it puts the survivor, back in charge and back in power of their own experience.
Yes, it's so important. When I hear people say we never heal, I really feel for the people who are in the thick of the symptoms.
Mhm.
And what hope does that give them to move forward in this work?
Right. Yeah. Like you said, like what hope is there if you feel like it's just always going to be your experience to relive the trauma, to constantly be dealing with these symptoms. And speaking of that, could you talk about some of the common symptoms? You mentioned a few of them, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure. Survivors' nervous systems are often in an ongoing heightened state of what's commonly known as fight, flight, or freeze. This releases toxic amounts of cortisol, adrenaline, and other hormones into their bodies that over time can cause all kinds of physical and psychological issues. Depression and anxiety are common, but there's much more. Some of the most common symptoms I see are triggers, which bring on rapid, intense nervous system dysregulation, also flashbacks, dissociation, nightmares or sleep avoidance, avoidance of trauma reminders, hypervigilance, intestinal issues, pelvic floor pain, and autoimmune disorders. A study done in 2016, 2017, the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey found that 5 of the symptoms they tested were significantly higher among women who reported sexual violence victimization compared to those who didn't. They include asthma, irritable bowel syndrome, frequent headaches, chronic pain, and difficulty sleeping. Activity limitations include difficulty dressing or bathing, difficulty concentrating, remembering or making decisions, and difficulty doing errands alone. For men, 6 were found to be significantly higher. They include asthma, HIV and AIDS, frequent headaches, chronic pain, difficulty sleeping, and serious difficulty hearing, along with the same activity limitations. Most survivors have several symptoms, which leads to a feeling of being out of control of their body and or mind and causes a lot of suffering. I posted an extensive list of trauma symptoms on my healingsexualtrauma.com blog. The list was initially inspired by a list Peter Levine published. I made some changes and added to it based on my work with survivors and on the research.
That study just totally underscores this mind body connection. Like asthma, you wouldn't think of as something that would come up for somebody who survived trauma, but it just goes to show you how much that experience impacts your holistic self.
That's so true.
Getting back to this feeling of safety, what are some ways that you recommend for someone to get back to that feeling? And why is this so important to all of this work?
Being in a state of calm or presence is the opposite of dysregulation. We can only feel calm and present if we feel safe or relatively safe. And as we work on integrating the trauma and on memory reconsolidation, there are times when survivors will get dysregulated. When that happens, it's important to be able to titrate back to a state of relative safety to avoid causing further overwhelm. To get back to a feeling of safety or to experience it for the first time, I always start with grounding and then orienting. There are many ways to ground and many ways to orient. The orienting practice I favor is one that involves slowly scanning the environment surrounding you.
In your book, you talk about the vagus nerve. Can you talk about its role in healing from sexual trauma?
Sure, the reason I favor the orienting practice I just shared is because it engages the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is part of the autonomic nervous system. It's the parasympathetic branch that is responsible for regulating the nervous system, bringing it back to a state of homeostasis. It actually has two branches, ventral vagal and dorsal vagal. Ventral vagal is the calm, safe state designed for social engagement and unique to mammals. Dorsal vagal is the branch that's responsible for the immobilized freeze state. The vagus nerve starts on the left and right sides of the brain stem, then travels down through the neck, thorax, and abdomen, connecting with many major organs, including the heart, lungs, and gastrointestinal system. When our nervous systems become dysregulated, there's less blood flow to our prefrontal cortex, the rational and logical part of the brain, as well as the digestive tract and reproductive organs. Some of the blood is directed away from these areas and toward our limbs so that we have the strength and energy needed to fight or flee. Even if we go right to the freeze or dorsal vagal state, our system, as I understand it, rapidly moves through the fight, flight, or sympathetic state to get to dorsal vagal. I mentioned earlier that many survivors have digestive issues. This is one reason why. A sign of health is vagal efficiency. Some say vagal tone, but Stephen Porges, the man responsible for polyvagal theory, said he regrets using the word tone since a nerve cannot be toned like a muscle. So now he uses vagal efficiency. We need to develop vagal efficiency to be able to move fluidly between the states without becoming dysregulated.
What are some ways to engage that vagus nerve?
Well, there's some yoga practices that engage it, but the practice I mentioned, where you orient to the surroundings, you simply turn your neck all the way to one side, and then very, very slowly you scan the room as you turn all the way to the other side. So you're doing it in super slow motion, and then you're going to scan back to the side you started on and back to center. You have to do it slowly to give your nervous system time to respond to what it's taking in. Your eyes have a direct connection to the vagus nerve, so they're letting it know pretty directly that, hey, there's actually no danger here in this moment. I'm safe or I'm relatively safe right now. And that's all we have is right now. The body exists in the present only. It doesn't feel that way to survivors often because you're when you're having a flashback or you're triggered, you feel like you're reliving the trauma. But in reality, we only exist in the body in the present moment. And so we can work with that to regulate ourselves. So, like some other types of orienting don't engage the vagus nerve so much, that are very popular, like choosing a color, or, five things you see, four things you hear. That type of orienting practice, they can be helpful, but again, they don't engage the vagus nerve like turning your neck does.
Mhm. One thing, too, in your book that really stuck with me was sharing your own personal experience. You talked about it in regards to the different ways that we might respond to trauma. What are some of those responses, and how can we understand later when we're processing why our bodies reacted in a certain way?
The non scientific terms for responses during traumatic experiences, known as the four F's, are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. There's also feign and faint. The majority of survivors froze. The fawn, which is also called please and appease, response is common among childhood survivors. It's an attempt to curry favor in hopes that less harm will be done. In terms of my own example that I used in the Healing Sexual Trauma workbook to illustrate how our nervous system determines in the moment which state we'll move into, what Porges named neuroception. A few weeks after my 19th birthday, I was raped by someone I thought was a friend, while the young man I just started dating sat in the next room, unbeknownst to me until that moment, after having set me up for the assault. In shock, with tears streaming down my face, I repeatedly said no, but was unable to fight. Although I didn't know it at the time, the immense betrayal sent me into what's known as tonic immobility. 2 years later, I was running in a suburban neighborhood when I was assaulted by a stranger. This time, my nervous system remained unsympathetic as I fought for my life. And while traumatized, I averted the rape. Months later, while traveling for work, I again found myself betrayed by an acquaintance whom I thought was a friend, an employer who was in possession of my plane ticket home. Again, I said no, and again, my body froze as he raped me. In each situation, my body neurocepted the state that offered my best chance of survival. Like mine, your body responded in the best way possible under the circumstances you were in. The body is an organism that will always go towards survival.
I think that's really powerful. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your own story and illustrating the different ways that your body reacted in the moment to protect you. And what I think that does too is it helps to when you're understanding why your body had a certain response. I think that breaks down the shame that a lot of survivors feel to understand why they responded that way.
That's exactly why I shared my story there. It's just huge, the level of shame that survivors come in with for how their body responded, something they had no control of. And it's hard often to wrap their head around the fact that freezing was what helped keep them safe. But we process that, and after talking about it a little bit, like a light bulb goes off, and people get it.
Yeah, and I think there comes a lot of shame with that. One, as a society, we've done people wrong by putting shame into the equation, but then just feeling like, oh, I would have done something differently if I were in that situation when you truly have no idea what how your body would react in this scenario.
I just read a post on social media last night by a woman who'd been assaulted by her neighbor, and she said how the police were angry at her because she didn't use pepper spray or her keys on him. She froze. She froze. She wasn't able to do that. And the unfortunately, so many people in first responder type jobs and also in the legal system who are working with trauma survivors still don't understand much about trauma, and survivors are repeatedly shamed, and it's getting better, but there's so much room for growth in that area. People really need to become trauma informed that are in positions of power like that.
Absolutely. And that too would open the door for more people to share their stories without feeling like they're going to be shamed for the situation as well. It causes a just like a silence. Like it makes people want to be more silent about sharing their experiences because they don't know what the quote unquote backlash might be.
Yes, and on that same post, several people wrote like, fight, to, like just gave advice that again was not understanding what this person was going through. I mean, her nervous system might have been picking up on the fact that this person would have become much more violent if she had fought in that moment. And often that's the case because often the perpetrator is bigger and stronger and has a weapon of some type. Sometimes, not always, but um, things happen that even the perpetrator didn't plan when people fight back. So, in my example, the time my body let me fight, it was really a matter of life and death in that moment, that where the cost of not fighting was greater than the cost of fighting.
Yeah, it's like letting, like listening to your body's wisdom in those moments. Like your body, like you said, is designed to survive. It wants to survive. So the response is there on some level as a protection, no matter which of those F's your body responds with.
Right. And it's really not even a matter of listening to your body's wisdom. You just don't have a choice. You get thrown into the state. The issue is accepting your body's wisdom after the fact rather than feeling shamed for how your body chose to keep you alive.
Absolutely. That's really powerful. And I think one thing that probably plays a role in this too, you talk about it in your book, is mindfulness. Can you talk about what role that plays in healing? And also, mindfulness can seem like this very daunting prospect. Can you talk about how somebody who's very busy can fit this into their day to make time for it?
Yes, mindfulness strengthens your ability to choose where you want to focus your attention rather than feeling under the control of your thoughts. Research on mindfulness indicates a greater ability to manage and tolerate emotions, an increased ability to actively cope with stress, increased attention, focus, and concentration, improved empathy and insight, the promotion of healthy immune functioning, and increased growth of regulatory and integrative regions of the brain. So that's quite a bit right there. Reason backing it up to practice it. So mindfulness helps to grow new neural pathways that take you to a calm state and counteract the negativity bias that we all have. Some easy ways to fit it into your day are to mindfully do what you're already doing, like eating, washing dishes or other chores, taking a shower, practicing yoga, or going for a walk. All that mindfulness requires is that you keep your thoughts on the present moment. If they drift off to future worries or past regrets, simply acknowledge it and come back to the present moment by engaging one of your senses or following your breath. Mindfulness practice can seem pretty simple and straightforward, but doesn't come easy for many survivors who consciously or unconsciously avoid feeling present by disconnecting from their body, numbing out, or dissociating. If this is the case for you, mindfulness can be a challenge at first, so take it really slowly. You can start with staying present for 30 seconds, then work your way up to 1 minute and continue at a pace that's comfortable for you with the goal of eventually getting to 12 minutes of daily practice. If you become overwhelmed, change your focus from whatever it's been on, such as your breath, to something neutral like your hands, unless they're a trigger for you, or an innocuous object in your surroundings. So while you're doing mindfulness, you want to practice non striving, you want to keep the process slow. You want to observe the body mind with curiosity, to suspend judgment. Like when your thoughts drift away, the idea is not to beat yourself up about that, to just come back to present. And everyone at first has to do a lot of that. And also, it's a good time to make compassion for others and yourself a part of your practice.
That's actually a really good lead into my next question because I want to ask about self compassion because it feels like that concept or that practice might be challenging for a trauma survivor. How can someone begin to make space within themselves for this?
So you're absolutely right. Self compassion can be challenging for sexual trauma survivors or probably any trauma survivors. Many have been met with shaming comments when they've reported the trauma to family members, friends, law enforcement, hospital staff, even counselors, as we were talking about earlier. And this creates further trauma. There's a lot of mixed messaging, judgment, and shaming in our culture about the body and sexuality. Often, the deep conditioning around these issues creates a feeling of shame for something survivors had no control of. If they could have stopped the traumatic event, they would have. When a traumatic event is happening, our nervous system moves into one of two states. And for the sake of simplicity, I'll again use the non scientific terms fight, flight, or freeze. Most survivors freeze, then blame themselves for not having done more to fight. I explain why their body responded the way it did, that the body always goes towards survival, as I already mentioned, and I also teach them how to practice and take in self compassion. This can be challenging because deep down, the shame is often so intense they believe they don't deserve it. From a young age, they may have developed a pattern of constricting around their heart center. An infant or young child really has no way to protect themselves. So they constrict their muscles in an attempt to defend physically or emotionally from trauma. So somatically, this can feel like a shield around their heart, a heaviness, a twisting constriction, or a heart wall. And then there's the self defeating thoughts that might accompany the constriction. Early on in the practice, the inner critic can come on strong. The good news is that with consistent practice, the constriction softens, and I teach tools to befriend and or distance the inner critic.
That's really important. That inner critic can be extremely debilitating.
It can take months, to get there, and that's okay. That with consistent practice, you get there.
Yeah, that's important. I think a lot of this requires, continually showing up and trying even when it's hard.
Yeah.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hi, I'm Dr. Daniel Fox, author of the Borderline Personality Disorder Workbook. When you first are diagnosed with BPD, or you're first told that you may have borderline personality disorder, it can be very frightening and overwhelming. Because we have these ideas of what this disorder is, and you can feel trapped within it, trapped within this view or perspective of this thing that feels bigger than you and bigger than life. But the reality is that this is a disorder that can be managed, and that learning adaptive strategies can help you control it and do your life differently so that you determine the course of your life, not your BPD. To learn more and to sign up, go to bpdcourse.com.
In your book, you write, neither avoiding nor reliving the memories supports healing. Avoiding keeps you stuck, while reliving the episode can reinforce the trauma. Can you say more about that?
To integrate the effects of trauma, we need to activate the same parts of the brain and body that were activated during the event, dipping a little into the dysregulation we experienced when the event occurred, but not so much that it's overwhelming. When this happens, we use resources to bring the nervous system back into a regulated state. These can be internal, like developmental or psychological or somatic, and external, for instance, relational, financial, societal resources. In terms of avoiding, I want to say that some survivors suppress, minimize, or compartmentalize the trauma, and for some, the memory is unconsciously repressed. So, avoiding is not always a conscious choice, rather, their mind and body's way of preventing further overwhelm and therefore further trauma to their system. This happens when the resources needed to begin the healing were unavailable. So, again, we don't want to shame ourselves because we waited to do the work of healing. We might not have been ready, our systems might not have been ready, or we just might not have had it available to us. And this helps to explain why many survivors develop new symptoms, where symptoms worsen 10, 20, 30, even 60 years after the traumatic event occurred or events. I see this as their system screaming to get their attention, telling them they're ready now and it's time to do the work of healing. Reliving the memories, for instance, telling your trauma story over and over again to yourself or to those you've already told it to, is not healthy because it keeps the nervous system in a dysregulated state and keeps survivors identifying as victims. You were a victim when it happened, but it's not your identity. You survived. That said, it's a personal choice how one wants to be identified. Some people don't like the term survivor, and that's okay. The client should choose what language works for them, and the therapist should honor it unless it's doing the client harm. Avoidance prevents or inhibits healing because integrating the impact trauma has on your memory calls for activation of the same parts of your brain and body that were activated during the traumatic experience. The key to moving past distancing and reliving painful memories is to maintain awareness of your surroundings in the present moment every time you remember or talk about the trauma. So, this is something that mindfulness helps with as well, and also paying attention somatically to both your internal environment and your external environment. So, noticing your relation to the space around you and what you're feeling around you, and not only basing safe or not safe on what you're experiencing internally, which a lot of survivors will tend to do.
Yeah, and just to go back, it seems like the core of this work is keeping yourself in that present moment.
Yes, as much as it's the work is there,
Mhm.
and that's a big part of coming back to the present moment. When you're getting dysregulated, you're working to find your way back.
Yeah, and you've mentioned a few times in our conversation about triggers. I want to just ask a little bit more about them. How can you begin to identify what a trigger is for you and the ways in which you might diffuse those?
So triggers are brought on by deeply fragmented reminders of the trauma and take your emotions from 0 to 100 in a second, impacting your well-being, your career, and your relationships. You might not consciously remember the traumatic experience or aspects of it, making it hard to identify or understand what brought on these symptoms, yet your body mind remembers. The first thing you want to do when triggered is to name it to yourself. Next, you'll want to focus on what you can do to help calm your nervous system in the moment. I have a long list of things that can help, and I'm always adding to it. So it will really depend on which state your nervous system was thrown into and where you are when you're triggered. So again, you want to name to yourself and perhaps others, if that feels safe, that you're triggered. Then ask yourself, what are my choices? What does my body want to do now? And choice is so important to keep coming back to as you're healing as well. It's when choice is robbed from us that we become victimized. So, reminding yourself you have choice is very helpful in the healing journey. So, back to like being experiencing a trigger, being in that moment. If, for example, you want to flee or you're about to cry, give yourself permission to leave the meeting or classroom and go into a bathroom where you can do some of the practices that will help to calm and regulate your nervous system. And once you've calmed down, you can go back. And it might not seem like much, but boy, I was not giving myself permission at first. It took me a little while to say, the hell with it. I'm going to just leave if I have to leave. And I think it's important that we consciously think about that when we're not triggered and remind ourselves that we get to take care of ourselves that way. So the grounding and orienting included in my practice in the book Coming into Safety or Presence can be a good place to start, or reminding yourself of the year and the date that you're here in the present and then offering yourself compassion. Sometimes something more drastic is needed. You can submerge your hands or face in ice. You can hold a piece of ice to the back of your neck. And other times, wrapping yourself in a weighted blanket and sipping a warm cup of tea might feel right. It's very personal and trigger specific what you're needing. After your nervous system is regulated, you'll want to take some time to try to recognize what the trigger was. Anything can be a trigger. They're impossible to avoid. Trauma triggers can be brought on by any of your senses and by sensations and emotions. It's a good idea to keep a journal as you work on them, noticing what you're sensing, what emotions and what sensations you were aware of. While triggers are impossible to avoid, you can rid yourself of trauma triggers. My favorite way to do that is with EMDR because when done right, it's so effective and includes integration and memory reconsolidation. We're also triggered by good things. A favorite song can be a happy trigger, or what Deb Dana named a glimmer. Getting in touch with glimmers, staying with them a little longer, is resourcing. Like mindfulness, it helps your brain to strengthen or form new neural pathways that take you to a calm state.
I love the glimmers. I actually heard of that term last year, right before I was diagnosed with cancer and went through a treatment. And those glimmers, like learning about that concept and just looking for those was so important to maintaining my mental health as best as I could while going through treatment. So I totally love that. That's sort of like the positive trigger. I like that. I didn't think that was a real concept until I heard of that.
I imagine a lot of this applies to what you went through and how challenging that whole experience must have been for you to make it through.
Yeah, I definitely related to quite a few things in your book, so I was really thankful to be reading it.
Thank you.
In your book, you also have a good section on healthy boundaries. Can you talk about what it means to have healthy boundaries and why this is important?
Yeah, it is so important. I'm glad you're asking. The violation of physical and psychological boundaries is inherent in sexual trauma. Boundaries were not respected. Instead, they were ignored, breached, and shattered. As a result, many survivors struggle to set healthy boundaries, and some have internalized the unjust implication given that they didn't have the right to have and enforce a boundary. Relationally, you're continuously navigating and negotiating boundaries, whether intentionally or not. Boundaries help protect you from being mistreated and let others know how you would like to be treated. They create healthy physical and emotional personal space and promote self agency, allowing your actions to align with your values rather than doing what someone else wants you to do or being who someone else wants you to be. All of your boundaries, even the unhealthy ones, were survival resources at some point in your life. The problem is you'll pay a price if you haven't learned to set healthy boundaries or don't set them moving forward. You need healthy boundaries to clearly convey yes and no. And without them, you may feel used or coerced, even when others have no intention of taking advantage of you and would respect your boundaries if you set them. People with healthy boundaries tend to not over or undershare personal information, to be accepting when others say no to them. They tend to value their own opinion, know their personal wants and needs, and never compromise their values for others. Physically, there's concordance between their words, gestures, and expressions.
That's a really huge point to notice what the positives of having those healthy boundaries are and what that looks like. And along with those boundaries is obviously the big word consent. In your book, you talk about that it's an ongoing process. Can you say more about that?
Sure, if you give your consent once, it doesn't mean that it's ongoing or that you've consented to increase sexual contact, even with a partner or spouse. Consent is a boundary, and boundaries are fluid and malleable. They're an ongoing process of making choice. As survivors feel sexually, they're likely to experience moments of awkwardness, discomfort, and fear as implicit fragments of the trauma surface and unconscious beliefs play out. When this happens, it will feel even more challenging to make a clear choice. If this happens to you, be gentle with yourself as you continue to pay attention to your boundaries. You have to get to know them before you can communicate them to others. Unintegrated trauma can further complicate consent due to potential influence from unconscious trauma responses. For instance, a survivor might become aroused in ways that are self destructive by unconsciously reenacting their trauma, known as repetition compulsion. It's important to check in with yourself in each circumstance to make sure that giving consent aligns with all of you, your body, mind, your values, and that you're not experiencing a fawn response. And the fawn response is one reason why boundaries can be hard for some survivors, if that tends to be their go to. Um, it's hard at first for them to give themselves permission to even have a boundary. So it's really important work. And that's why I dedicated a chapter of the book to boundaries.
Yeah, and just like that, checking in with yourself to understand even your unconscious, motivations or reactions to certain situations. Like I wouldn't have thought about the unconscious part of that.
Yeah, it can be really big. I mean,
Yeah.
repetition compulsion is a really serious thing, and it plays out for a lot of survivors.
Yeah, that's really scary to deal with, I imagine.
Yeah, well, again, it's unconscious, so
Mhm.
people don't really realize it usually until it's pointed out to them or until years later,
Mhm.
and it can be really painful to know that you are reenacting something, hoping for a better outcome that never comes.
Mhm. And Erica, as we wrap up, what are some ways to strengthen our resilience?
All of the things we've been talking about, any of the practices that help to regulate your nervous system, like grounding, orienting, vagal efficiency, mindfulness, along with breath work, healthy boundaries, staying with your glimmers longer, they all strengthen resilience.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good place to stop unless you have any final thoughts for our listeners.
Yeah, a final thought I just wanted to share is that if you're a survivor, no matter what happened to you, it wasn't your fault. You didn't give permission for them to hurt you. Your body did what it had to do to help you survive. It's never too late to heal. With the right tools and support, healing from sexual trauma is always possible. And I want you to know that you're not alone. I also want to mention that listeners can go to my website, healingsexualtrauma.com, for a free copy of the first chapter of the Healing Sexual Trauma Workbook, which includes the grounding and orienting practice I mentioned, coming into safety or present. And I also have a free ebook on there, The Many Ways to Ground.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erica. I love that sentiment to leave on to, that it's never too late to heal. And just like thank you so much for your time, for your vulnerability, sharing your own story, and for your work helping survivors through all of this.
Well, right back at you, Cassie. And I really appreciate the opportunity to get to come on and speak with your listeners and with you. Thank you.
Overcome shame and stigma and bring a newly felt sense of safety, awareness, and life to your body. If you've experienced rape, sexual abuse, molestation, or sexual trauma, you may feel as if you've lost your sense of self. You may have difficulty setting boundaries or building satisfying sexual relationships. Sometimes you may even feel like your body isn't your own. You aren't alone. The scars of sexual trauma exist not only in the mind, but also in the body. And in order to heal, build resilience, and discover a sense of hope, you must address both. Drawing on the powerful mind body techniques of somatic therapy, the Healing Sexual Trauma Workbook is a step by step guide to overcoming the psychological effects of sexual trauma and increasing positive body awareness and vitality. You'll find tools to help you create an internal sense of safety and become more embodied and present. You'll also discover ways to establish boundaries, move beyond intense feelings like shame, fear, and guilt, and deal effectively with triggers. Finally, you'll learn how to cultivate self compassion and the confidence needed to live your best life. What happened to you isn't your fault and it doesn't define you. With the right tools, you can live a full and satisfying life beyond sexual trauma. This workbook will help guide you every step of the way. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code podcast25 to receive 25% off your entire order. New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For over 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change. The best continuing education training does more than just fulfill requirements. It opens your mind to new possibilities, increases your confidence, and gives you powerful tools to transform your clients' lives. Praxis Continuing Education and Training partners with world-class experts to create cutting-edge, evidence-based courses for mental and behavioral health professionals. Learn how to heal trauma with Robin Walzer, explore values with Kelly Wilson, and master the basics of acceptance and commitment therapy with Matt Boone through an on-demand course. Or join experts and like-minded professionals live to take your practice to a new level. Find your next training opportunity at praxiscet.com. That's praxiscet.com. Do you have an idea for another episode? Do you want to send us a message? Our email address is podcast@newharbinger.com. We'd love to hear from you. This podcast was edited by Jesse Fancushion. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope that you might share it with anyone who could benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.